Welcome back to Sleepy Saga Histories, where quiet stories from long ago are told by firelight to help you drift away. Tonight, you'll journey through a forgotten moment in time, a soft thread in the fabric of ancient life, slow and unhurried. Let the day fall away, your breath slow, and if this story keeps you company, you're always welcome back to the fire. The sand above was silent now. The cheering had faded hours ago, swallowed by the great stone belly of the Colosseum. He could feel the faintest tremor in the floor above, the last few attendants sweeping up broken wood and scattered straw. Somewhere up there, torches still flickered in bronze sconces, lighting the quiet corridors where senators had once walked in silken sandals, their voices low with wine and victory. But here beneath, where he lay, there was only shadow. He sat on the edge of the stone bench, elbows resting on his knees, hands dangling like empty cups. His tunic was damp with the sweat of the day, though the air was cool now. Around him, the other cells were quiet. Some snored, some whispered to gods he'd never heard of, and some lay with eyes open, as he did, staring at the low ceiling and imagining what sky might feel like. The walls sweated too, rough and damp with centuries of breath. The scent of iron lingered, not the smell of clean, sharpened weapons, but the heavy stink of blood, rust and bodies pressed against chains. The hypogeum, they called this place, the understage. Beneath the wooden arena boards, they'd built a maze of corridors, pulleys, cages and lifts. Here, lions paced behind bars, hooves shifted restlessly in darkness, and men waited, not to fight, but to rise. He had risen once, and he would rise again come dawn. His name was Marius. He had been called that once, before the training, before the mark was burned into his arm, before the crowd began to scream other names at him. The crowd did not want Marius. The crowd wanted Silvanus, the wild man, the forest beast. It was what the Lanista had chosen for him, after seeing him fight bare-chested, with a net and trident. They thought it suited him. Silvanus, lord of trees and wild things, a joke in bronze and leather, but here, in the quiet, he was Marius again. A boy who had once watched men march past his village, their spears gleaming like stars. A boy who had run into the fields after them, holding a stick, pretending to be strong. He leaned back against the wall. The stone was cool. Above his head, faintly, came the hiss of oil being poured into a torch. Someone still moved up there. Perhaps a guard, perhaps a priest, lighting a flame to Nemesis, goddess of balance, the one they prayed to before the games. The games, that's what they called it. Munera, the offerings, blood for glory, combat as ritual, as spectacle. It had started with funeral rites, or so they said. Rich men dying, their heirs giving the gift of death in their honour. Two men fighting at a grave to send the soul on stronger wings. But that had been long ago. Now it was for coin, for politics, for the emperor's pleasure. He shifted on the bench and reached for the flask of water near his feet. It was warm, but wet enough. The clay scraped faintly against stone. He drank, then poured a little onto the floor, a silent offering to whoever watched over him now. He had trained in the Ludus Magnus, the great school just east of the Colosseum. It was connected by an underground tunnel, so the fighters would not have to walk through crowds before the games. The tunnel was dark, cool, lit with occasional torches. Marius remembered the feeling of walking through it, the sound of footsteps, the way even the bravest went quiet. That silence was louder than any roar. In the Ludus, they rose early. The sun had barely touched the rooftops before the Lanista had them running, shouting, swinging wooden swords until their arms ached. They learned to move, to measure breath, to fall without breaking. Some fought with tridents, some with curved blades, others with heavy nets and long daggers. The Retiarius, the net man, was mocked often but feared in the arena. He had to dance, light-footed and clever, using distance as his shield. Marius had trained with both net and trident, not his first choice, but the Lanista said it matched his body. Tall, lean, fast on his feet. He had once fought a man with a scutum, the great curved shield, and a short stabbing sword. The man moved like a wall, slow but crushing. Marius had circled, feinted, thrown his net, missed, and danced away. The match had lasted too long. The crowd had begun to jeer, so he'd stepped forward, taken the hit, and used the trident to pin the man's foot. A lucky move. Luck mattered more than skill some days. Some men fought to win freedom. Others fought because they had nothing else. And some fought because they liked the sound of the crowd. Marius had not yet decided which he was. He leaned back, letting the darkness swallow the edges of the cell. Somewhere down the corridor, a lion gave a slow, heavy exhale. Not a roar, just the kind of breath that meant it was turning over in its cage. A reminder that he was not the only beast beneath the floor. The Colosseum above, the Flavian Amphitheatre, as it was known, could hold over 50,000 people. Seats rose like a mountain, tier after tier, the best ones closest to the sand. Senators sat in marble chairs, the plebs higher up on wooden benches. Women were allowed, but only at the top, far from the blood. At least in theory. He had looked up once after a match, sweat in his eyes, blood running down his arm. The sun had caught the rim of the uppermost tier, and for a moment it had looked like gold. Just for a moment. Then the next fight began, and the crowd forgot him. He ran a hand down his leg, feeling the old scar where the blade had caught him during training. Not deep enough to kill, just enough to remember. Someone had whispered once, an older man, his voice low and cracked, that each scar was a line in a story, a book carved into the body, telling who you were, what you'd survived. If that were true, Marius had already written several chapters, but he did not know how the book would end. He only knew that in a few hours the wooden lifts would creak and groan, rising up through trapdoors, delivering him into light. He let his head rest against the wall, closed his eyes, listened to the breathing in the cages, the shifting of sand above, the soft, soft sound of his own thoughts drifting into sleep. The morning light hadn't come yet, but the torches burned steadily now in the corridor outside his cell. Marius could hear the footsteps, soft sandals, deliberate pacing, and the jangle of keys. The Lanista was doing his rounds. The Lanista's name was Falco, a broad man with a crooked jaw and one blind eye, milky and still. The other eye missed nothing. He was not cruel, not the way some were, but he had no use for softness. To him, each man was a blade, forged, sharpened and tested. If it broke, he tossed it aside. If it endured, he paraded it before the crowd, like a prize boar. He didn't hate the men beneath him, but he didn't love them either. Falco had chosen Marius from a slave market 3 years ago. The memory was still sharp. Marius had stood with wrists bound, shoulders stiff, stomach empty. He had tried not to meet anyone's eyes, but Falco had stopped in front of him, looked him up and down, then asked a simple question. "Have you ever held a spear?" Marius had nodded. That was enough. He'd arrived at the Ludus Magnus in the winter, when the rains were thick and the sand in the training yard turned to mud. Falco hadn't spoken to him again for weeks, not until he'd proven he could move quickly, fight smart, bleed without crying out. That was when the name Silvanus was given, a nod to strength and something else, a wildness. Marius remembered his first proper match, not training, not practice, but before a crowd. It had been a small arena, not the Colosseum, but packed with shouting voices and waving hands. He'd felt the eyes like heat against his skin. The man he fought was older, stronger, with scars across his chest like whipcords. They circled each other for what felt like hours. In truth, it had been minutes. He had won by catching the man's ankle in his net, yanking hard, then striking once, just once, with the trident. Afterward his arms had trembled so badly he could barely hold the cup of water they gave him. That night, Falco patted his shoulder, just once, and said, "You're not dead. That's a start." He thought of that now, sitting in the dark again, while Falco's footsteps echoed down the stone corridor. Behind the lanista came two doctores, the trainers, each focused on a different fighting style. There was Marcus, who taught the Mumio fighters, the ones who carried great rectangular shields and short gladi, their helmets crested with horsehair, and their movements slow, deliberate, crushing. And there was Decimus, who trained the more agile types, the Retiari like Marius, and the Thrices, who danced with curved swords and round shields. Each doctor had once been a fighter. You could tell by how they walked, upright, balanced, like a man always expecting a blade to come from somewhere. The Ludus itself wasn't just a training yard. It was a barracks, a forge, a small kingdom. In the outer rooms, armour was hammered into shape, brass polished until it gleamed under torchlight. Wooden practice swords hung from hooks, splintered and smooth with use. In one corner, men sharpened blades under the eye of the quartermaster. In another, slaves carried buckets of sand to cover the floors, to soak up the sweat and blood. Some nights, Marius had stood at the edge of the training yard, listening to the sound of metal on metal. The rhythm of the hammers soothed him. It reminded him of his father, who had worked with tools, fixing carts and hinges before the taxes came, before the soldiers came. He pulled the thread of that memory softly, like a man turning a page too fragile to crease. His father's hands had been thick, the fingers cracked with dirt and work. He used to whistle when he worked, an off-key tune that sounded like birdsong mixed with breath, but that life was gone. Now he lived in the Lanista's world, where each man was worth something only if he drew breath and drew blood in turn. The stronger you were, the better you ate. The better you fought, the louder they cheered. And if you survived long enough, if you were skilled, lucky and marketable, you might earn your rudies, the wooden sword that meant freedom. But freedom was not always what it seemed. Marius had seen men earn it, only to return. One had sold his rudies to pay a debt. Another had come back to train others, unable to live without the fight. The arena marked you, not just with scars, but with something deeper. It was hard to walk away from the noise, once it had wrapped itself around your soul. In the distance, a horn sounded softly. Not the signal for the crowd, that would come at dawn. This was a quieter call, for the priests, for the morning rites. The Romans believed in omens, in signs. Before each day of games they offered prayers to the gods, to Jupiter for strength, to Mars for victory, and to Nemesis, so that glory would not outpace humility. Some gladiators wore charms beneath their armour, bits of bone, carved wood, etched metal. Marius had none. His luck came from silence, from remembering each step before the fight. Where to stand, how to breathe, how to faint. That was his ritual. A shadow passed outside his cell. Falco again. The lanista paused, looked in. Marius didn't move. Falco nodded once, then continued on. There was comfort in the routine. It didn't matter if you were free or enslaved. The sun rose, the crowd screamed, and the fight began. In some ways it was simpler than the world above. No lies in the arena, only blade against blade. He rubbed his hands together slowly, feeling the calluses on his palms. The skin there was thick, hard from practice. He could remember when it blistered easily. Now it was like hide. Somewhere above, the oil lamps were being trimmed. The final sweep of the arena floor was happening now. Sand smoothed, blood from the last fight buried, the wooden trapdoors checked and oiled. Tomorrow's games would be grand. He had heard the murmurs. A nobleman's funeral. That always meant spectacle, exotic animals, music. The Venatio with hunters and beasts, and of course the Munera, the fights. He would be among them. The crowd would chant his name, not his real one. The other, Silvanus. But tonight he could still be Marius. He lay back against the cool stone, folding his hands over his chest. The air was damp, the stone slick with the breath of centuries. But he was used to it now. The dark no longer frightened him. It was simply a pause between roars. Tomorrow he would rise through the floor, but for now he would sleep beneath it. Sleep, when it came slow. Marius lay on his side, breathing in the familiar scent of dust and oil. The rough wool blanket beneath him, barely enough to soften the stone. The walls were cold, but they held a kind of silence he had grown to trust. Even now, after all the fights, after all the noise, there was something peaceful in the way the dark hummed around him. Like the pause before a heartbeat. In this stillness, thoughts came, not as words, but as flickers. The face of his mother, shadowed by the years. The shape of his old home, with its broken tiles and overgrown vines. Somewhere in the hills beyond Capua, a stream he once drank from as a boy, and a promise he'd whispered once before being taken. I'll come back. But now as he drifted, the thoughts gave way to dreams, and the dreams came on like waves. He dreamed of the sand, stretching endless beneath a red sky. Not the true arena, but a place the mind created, stitched from memory and fear and hope. There were figures moving in the haze, some armoured, others bare, shadows of old opponents. He could hear the clang of steel, but it sounded far away, like thunder over a distant hill. In the dream, he stood barefoot. His trident wasn't in his hands. He had no shield, just a tunic, plain and thin, and the smell of sweat on his chest. Yet he wasn't afraid. Not exactly, only aware. Every sound was sharp. Every footstep echoed like it mattered. Then the crowd emerged. Not real faces, but masks, thousands of them, rising in tiered rows like statues. All silent, all watching. No cheers, no roars, just that heavy stare, unblinking. And in the middle of the sand stood someone. Tall, familiar. Marius stepped forward, squinting. But he already knew. It was himself. Younger, clean-faced. A farmer's son. A boy who still believed. The boy looked at him and asked, "Is this all there is?" But Marius couldn't answer. He woke before he could. The stone cell was still around him. The torch outside had burned lower, its light casting long bars across the floor. The sounds of early morning had begun. A cough from down the corridor, a clatter of metal. Somewhere a door slammed. A sleepy voice muttered a curse. He sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The dream lingered, like mist on a hill. It wasn't rare for fighters to dream the arena before they stepped into it. Some believed it was the gods whispering, or the spirits of those who had died before. Others said it was the mind's way of preparing, of rehearsing the death you hoped not to meet. There was no way to know. He rose, stretching, his joints popping quietly in the stillness. In the cell across from him, another gladiator named Vix stirred. He was a secutor, trained to fight men like Marius, slow, shielded, helmet-shaped to deflect the net's throw. They never spoke much, but tonight Vix looked up and grunted. "Did you sleep?" Marius nodded. "Good," said Vix. "You'll need it." That was the only exchange. No good lucks, no fear-shared words. Each man had his own ritual, his own ghosts. He poured water from the jug beside his mat and splashed his face. Cold, bracing, the kind that brought you fully back into your body. The kind that reminded you were still here, still breathing. Soon the first bell would toll. The aedituus would pass through, unlocking each cell. Men would step out into the training yard, some to stretch, some to pray, others to simply pace in silence. Meals would be light today. Bread, dried fruit. Enough to keep the stomach from knotting, but not enough to slow the limbs. He wrapped the cloth of his tunic tighter around his waist. The armour would come later. For now, it was just skin and thought. In the halls above, servants were likely laying out the procession routes. Trumpets would sound soon. Banners would be lifted. The editor, the sponsor of the games, likely a senator or wealthy patrician, would arrive in his litter, flanked by slaves fanning him with feathers. This day had been promised as magnificus, grand sacred, in honour of the dead. Roman tradition held that games were owed to the spirits. That blood spilled on the sand brought balance to the world above. Marius thought of that often. The city believed the arena was a place of punishment, of justice, but here, beneath the stone, it was something else. A place where men became stories, where their names were shouted louder than any generals, where even slaves were cheered like gods for a moment before the blade. He didn't know if he would live through tomorrow, but he knew this: if he stepped into the sand with calm, with skill, with silence, then he would own that moment, even if it were his last. He looked down at his hands again. These were not the hands of a farmer anymore. They had broken ribs, crushed throats, held weapons longer than a soldier, but they still trembled sometimes, especially before the dawn. He knelt, placing his palms to the ground, feeling the cold seep through. Above, the Colosseum waited, and so did Rome. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor like distant thunder. Slow, deliberate, one after another, the march of sandals on stone. Marius sat still in the corner of his cell, waiting. This wasn't the moment they came for him. Not yet. This was the procession of the first fighters, the damnati, the condemned, those not trained but offered up by the courts, or the wrath of powerful men, sent into the arena as warnings more than warriors. They would die quickly, all of them. Marius had seen it before. The guards called out names, unlocking each cell with a loud iron clack. Torches threw dancing shadows across the walls, and in those flickers, Marius caught the hollowed expressions of the men walking past. Some were terrified, others already gone behind the eyes. One prayed loudly, another whispered a name, perhaps a child, a wife, someone they'd never see again. Their chains clinked faintly with each step. Marius bowed his head. Not out of pity, not anymore, but out of ritual. They deserved a glance, a nod. The dead walking deserved that much. When the noise faded and the corridor fell quiet again, he stood and stretched. His limbs were stiff. His back ached with the cold, but the motion helped. Routine was all they had. In the training yard, the sky above was turning a dusky purple, that strange in-between when night becomes morning. But the sun has not yet committed. Torches line the edge of the courtyard, fluttering in the breeze, and around them stood the gladiators, not yet cooled. Dozens of men, each with their own posture, their own silence. Marius joined them. Vic stood off to one side, sharpening the edge of his gladius slowly, on a worn stone. His movements were precise, methodical, not in haste, but in focus. Another fighter, Felix, was murmuring a prayer in Oscan, tracing a charm onto his wrist with oil. Nearby, two men stretched in practiced unison, backs bending, muscles popping. It was not unlike soldiers preparing for war, but it lacked the chatter, the camaraderie. Gladiators trained together but fought alone. In truth, many trained against each other. You could not be too close. At any moment, you might be called to fight the very man who shared your bread. Trust was a dangerous thing here. A trainer, known only as Rufus, strode among them with the air of a centurion. His whip was coiled at his side, though he rarely needed it. He barked orders with the rasp of a man who'd spent decades shouting above crowds, and most obeyed out of habit. Form a line, eyes ahead, we'll run the square twice, move. The men broke into motion, trotting across the hard-packed ground in a slow, even pace. Marius felt the chill air bite at his chest, but as his muscles warmed, the cold became a memory. He liked this moment, the rhythm of the run, the weight of feet against the earth. It reminded him of the first days, the days when he was just a body learning to survive. Rufus called again. Sparring, you know your pairs. The line broke. Marius found his way to the marked ring and squared off against a familiar opponent. A man named Tycho, thick-necked, bruised from old fights, but fast on his feet. They didn't speak. They simply nodded, and then they began. No weapons, only fists. The slaps of flesh echoed through the yard as men grappled, struck, twisted, and locked limbs. It wasn't for spectacle, it was for sharpness, to wake the body, to feel the timing, to remind the nerves that they must obey. Marius ducked a heavy swing, drove his elbow into Tycho's side, felt the brief shift of balance, and then stepped back. Tycho grinned. It lasted only minutes. Rufus's shout brought it to an end. You fight today, he said to Marius, pointing. Be ready by the third bell. Marius gave a nod. That was all. He knew what that meant. He would be in the third round of the games. Not the opening, not the throwaways, but not the grand finale either. Somewhere in the middle, the meat of the show. It was a good placement. He could make it count. Back in the cell, the torchlight was fading. A small plate had been left. Olives, a chunk of bread, and a cut of salted fish. It was more than most Romans would eat at this hour. Gladiators were investments. They had to be fed. He ate slowly, chewing each bite with deliberate calm. He'd learned long ago not to rush. It wasn't about enjoyment. It was about steadiness, letting the nerves settle into the body. Afterward, he drank a little water and sat against the wall. His gear lay folded beside him, the net neatly coiled, the trident oiled and ready, the manica, the padded arm guard that would protect his leading side, and the belt, worn but strong. Each item was his responsibility. He had trained with them for months. They had to become extensions of himself. He picked up the trident, feeling its weight again. He practiced a few thrusts in the confined space, slow, careful. It was not just about power, it was about precision. The crowd loved a clean strike, they loved the display, but more than anything, they loved control. Gladiators were not just killers, they were performers, and Rome expected a performance outside the second bell rang. Time was folding. The sun would rise soon. The third bell rang out like a sentence. Its deep toll resonated through the barracks, shaking the silence loose from the walls. Marius stood, his knees steady beneath him, and reached for his gear. Each movement now was ritual. The manica was strapped to his arm, its leather creaking faintly. The belt was pulled tight, anchoring his core. The net was slung over one shoulder, trident grasped firmly in his hand. The final piece was a strip of red cloth tied around his bicep, not for blood but for the crowd, a colour to track in the whirl of motion. Outside the cell, torches flickered in iron sconces. The corridor smelled of oil and sweat. Guards stood at intervals, faces unreadable. One of them, a younger man, looked at Marius with something like pity. He said nothing, just unlocked the gate and nodded him forward. The other fighters, the ones not chosen, watched in silence. Some offered small salutes, others turned away. The path to the arena was long and sloped gently upward. It curved, narrowing like the throat of a beast, and above, shafts of daylight pierced the gloom. The sound of the crowd was already rising. Not yet a roar, more a murmur like the wind through trees before a storm. And then brightness. The gate lifted. He stepped out into the sun. It was blinding at first after so much time in the half-dark. The sand beneath his feet was pale and fine, warm from the morning heat. All around him, the Colosseum rose in tiers, packed with Romans, senators in their marble seats, plebeians further back, vendors with trays of figs and wine, shouting to be heard over the din. It was not quiet, but it was not yet chaos. This was the breath before the plunge. The herald stepped forward from the shadow of the gate. He wore a bright green toga and carried a long staff. He raised his arm and called out the names of the combatants, his voice clear and theatrical. Marcus Valerius Marius of Capua Retiarius. And the crowd responded with a mixture of cheers and groans. The Retiarius, a net fighter, was seen by some as less noble than the heavily armoured secutor. But others admired the speed, the cunning, the finesse. The opponent stepped forward from the opposite gate, a secutor named Cassius, known for his size and brute strength. His helmet gleamed, the eye slits narrow, the crest short and practical. He carried a short sword and a tall curved shield. The two men approached the centre, saluting the box of the game's sponsor, a portly senator in robes of deep purple, surrounded by attendants. He barely looked up from his cup of wine, and then the trumpet sounded. Cassius advanced immediately, shield up, sword ready, closing the distance with thudding steps. Marius darted to the side, circling, light on his feet. He flicked the net once, a warning. Cassius ignored it. They closed. Marius struck first, casting the net wide, a ripple of silver threads, aimed low. Cassius blocked it with his shield and countered with a lunge. The blade glanced off Marius's manica with a metallic hiss. The crowd shouted approval. They circled again. Dust rose from their heels. Marius feinted left, then spun right, striking with the trident. One tine caught Cassius's shoulder, a shallow hit but clean. Blood appeared. The crowd erupted. Cassius bellowed and charged. Marius sidestepped and kicked up sand behind him. He needed space. The net was still in hand, still ready, and then he threw it again, this time catching the legs. Cassius stumbled, just enough. The trident struck again, this time deeper into the thigh. Cassius dropped to one knee. Marius stepped back, breathing hard, trident lowered, but ready. The crowd waited. The editor, the man with the final say, Sokuxiat, looked down from his podium. Marius stood over his opponent, chest heaving. Cassius was not yet dead, but beaten. The hand signal came slowly. Thumb to the side. Not death. Not this time. Mercy! Marius lowered his weapon and stepped back. Cassius was dragged off by attendants. The gate opened again, and Marius walked toward it, not triumphantly, not with fanfare, but alive. Inside the corridor, the shadows wrapped around him like old friends. A slave offered him a cup of water. Another placed a cloak over his shoulders. Rufus stood nearby, nodding once. Well done! Marius sat again in his cell, staring at his hands. The crowd still roared behind the stone. Another match had begun. He would rest, eat, train, and wait, because Rome always wanted more. And beneath the sand, a gladiator always waited for morning.